Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to Switch to Life. And in today's video, we are going to be reviewing the first ever animated movie of all time. That, of course, is Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And the reason is because the remake is coming out this Friday. So that means that in a week, I will be posting a review of the live action version of this movie. And with that in mind, let's talk about what makes this version so great. Obviously, it's the first animated movie ever, so it didn't just follow or break the mold, it created the mold. I mean, you never know. Maybe if this movie was never made, some other company would have taken the spot, but still. So, this movie came out back in 1937, which means that this movie probably started production over 90 years ago. And, well, unfortunately, while the animation is pretty good, especially considering the time, it has definitely aged. Honestly, I think that the animals and the way that they moved, they were pretty good with their animation techniques. In fact, I thought the animators were very creative. I'm pretty sure that Walt Disney just let the animators play around, and that's actually really good because it gave the animals time to be creative with how they went about cleaning, and they were also extremely funny. Though I did feel sorry for the turtle every time there was a stampede. Then there was the background scenery, amazingly beautiful. But, when it came to human characters like Snow White and even Prince Charming or whatever his name is in this version, I just didn't really like it. You can tell that there was something lacking. They just couldn't nail the faces right. I mean, they fixed this problem by the time Pinocchio came out, but still. Oh, and also the evil queen was actually pretty beautifully animated, I'm gonna add. But despite the fact that this movie was the first, it did a lot of things right with its animation. I love how the water would move throughout this movie, like tears falling down someone's faces, a river flowing, and of course the scene where the dwarves are going yeah, that was really fun to watch. I also loved the detail that went into the character movements. Not only were they moving pretty fluidly, but they also added shadows and reflections in the water, which is really hard to do and honestly really amazing that they went ahead and included that stuff. I also love the way they used animation to make it so that trees and other things in the forest would come to life in a horrifying way, really showing how much an active imagination can bring personality to inanimate objects, which is really good. Now, like I said, this is the first animated movie, so there's gonna be some mistakes. They just couldn't nail the human faces to the point where they were believable. They just look fake and not really real. But then they got the dwarves right, they got the evil queen right, and for some strange reason, I did find that the way the characters would express themselves, I will admit that the animation was pretty fluid, but sometimes you could definitely tell that the characters were making unrealistic facial expressions, and sometimes their heads would actually grow to disproportionate sizes. That being said, for the first ever animated movie, I think this nailed every single checkbox. The voice acting, it could definitely use some work. I will admit they got some great voice actors, they got some incredible singing talent for Snow White, not to mention a bunch of the other characters have incredibly cool voices. The problem is it's just, once again, held back by the technology of 1937. I have no complaint about the voice acting aside from that. But then there's the music, which is extremely good. I really enjoyed the music for this. Granted, it's kind of easy to enjoy the music when about 90% of the movie is music. Yeah, apparently for some strange reason, instead of having the characters talk in normal expressions, they would just constantly have the characters talk in rhyme. Whether it was the character giving a monologue in rhyme or picking up another character's dialect and finishing the rhyme. 90% of the time, the characters would be speaking in rhyme. And honestly, that just made it so that they felt like they were going to start bursting into song at random moments, but the problem is that half the time they didn't burst into song. However, I will admit, the music really carried this, especially with the way the characters would speak, how they would act. The music would always accompany it. Instead of just a normal footstep, you hear a squeak. And then it's to the beat of what's going on in the background. The background music is carrying this movie, which is really good. Unfortunately, I don't really think there's any catchy songs in this, but again, that's just because we're used to Disney characters that burst into song. Here, there's love songs and occasionally the Hi-Ho from the Dwarves, which is actually my favorite song from this movie, but as I was saying, there's not really anything catchy that you would find yourself singing to on a Disney playlist. But then again, that's just because they put so much effort in the background music, where the music would be carrying the actions of what the characters were doing on screen, which in my opinion is really good. Now, I've already said that I like the writing for this movie, but what about the story? Well, it's your generic Snow White story, which, yeah, I admit, it's Snow White. Obviously, there's a ton of versions of this, and this one might not be the best, but it's still the one that's probably the most popular. Now, the story opens up with a bunch of text detailing that Snow White is the daughter of a king, and the king decided to remarry after her mother died, and then the king died. And that's when the evil stepmother became the queen of the kingdom, and she decided she wanted to be the fairest in the land, and because of that, decided to make it so Snow White would always be dressed in rags so that she would never become more beautiful than the queen. Unfortunately, as time passed, Snow White did grow up and become more beautiful, and so when that actually happened and the queen asked her magic mirror who the fairest in the land was, and it answered Snow White, the queen decided to send a huntsman out into the woods with Snow White, at which point the huntsman would kill Snow White and put her heart in a jewelry box. And luckily, the huntsman realized that he has some loyalty to the long-dead king, and he wasn't going to kill Snow White. That, or he was astounded by the fear on the beautiful woman's face that he was going to kill. So because of that, he just told her to run away, at which point he cut out a pig's heart and put it in the box and gave it to the queen. But then the queen asked her magic mirror what was in the box, and it turns out she found out it was a pig's heart, and in some stories, she actually punished the huntsman, and, well, she didn't in this movie, but I kind of wish that we saw a scene like it. Then again, this was supposed to be for kids back in the 1930s, so I don't know. Anyway, Snow White runs into the woods where her active imagination takes over and she sees scary trees coming to life. But then a bunch of woodland creatures show up and help calm her down, and they end up singing a song. And when Snow White calms down, she asks if the woodland creatures know a place where she can live and hide from the queen's wrath. And luckily, they take her to a cottage in the woods where 7 dwarves would go. Obviously, Snow White doesn't know they're dwarves. She just walks in and assumes that because of all the tiny chairs and the tiny beds, they are all just children. And because of how filthy the house is, they probably don't have a mother to clean up after them. Which is a little outdated, I will admit, because, well, back in ye olden days when this movie was made, it was common for the man to just go to work and then come home and expect his wife to take care of the cleaning, the cooking, and pretty much everything. Luckily, Snow White doesn't really let that deter her, so being raised to do servant work, thanks to her evil stepmother, she decided to get to work on cleaning the house and cooking stew for the children when they would come home. So we cut away to the dwarves who are mining for gems, which I guess is their job, and then they're going to sell the gems for profit, even though we never really see that on screen. But then they just sing hi-ho as they march home, at which point they discover Snow White sleeping in 3 of their beds, thinking that she's a monster. So they go in ready to attack, at which point they notice that Snow White is actually just a normal human girl, and they're all kind of smitten. in the words of Grumpy, they have feminine wiles. So that's when Snow White wakes up and they all get talking. She gets a chance at guessing their names, which are really funny names, but they're dwarves, so they are expected to have funny names. You got Doc, who is kind of the head honcho of the team, though I do love that he has this weird way of mixing up his words.
Search every cook and nanny, hook and granny, search everywhere.
You have Dopey, who is the dumb one, who never speaks, actually, because he never really tried to speak. And, well, he's super funny. We get to see a lot of funny antics with him on screen. But then there's Grumpy, who, unlike the rest of the dwarves, doesn't trust Snow White at all because he's afraid of women for some strange reason. And then there's the other dwarves who don't stand out compared to the other three. We have Sleepy, Bashful, Happy, and Sneezy. Sneezy being my favorite of the bunch. So they get talking and Snow White says that she's willing to cook and clean for them if they decide to let her stay with them. And they all agree except for Grumpy, and the reason they kind of want to get on her good side because she's a girl. I mean, honestly, I think that this movie is just outdated. Good for the times, and honestly, it still holds up to this day. Problem is that there are some customs that aren't really okay in today's standards. And you know what? I'm actually okay with them remaking the movie if it means that the only reason that they let Snow White stay isn't just because she's a girl and they want to get it on with her. But anyway, as time passes, we see Snow White trying to teach the dwarves manners, like washing hands before eating dinner. And yeah, that makes sense considering that they work in a mine for a living, so their hands are covered in dirt. And I really love how grumpy can be, especially considering he believes that Snow White is taking over by using her feminine wiles to make the other 6 dwarves do idiotic and stupid things. But over time, he does warm up to Snow White. So, as time passes, the dwarves end up treating Snow White with a lot of respect, even offering all 7 of their beds to Snow White, and then they just sleep in the furniture down in the living room. And then there's also where they have a dance party, and things are going great for Snow White and the 7 dwarves. Until the evil queen, who asks the magic mirror what's in the box, is revealed a pig's heart, so Snow White is still alive, and she decides that if she can't get someone to do it, she's gonna have to kill Snow White herself. So she uses magic potions in her cellar to create a disguise for herself, turning herself into a really old lady. And this old lady, while she does look frail, also looks extremely evil and wicked, and definitely ugly. Yeah, if you want to be the fairest in the land, that's kind of sending a mixed message. Anyway, she uses another one of her books to concoct a sleeping death, which essentially means she's going to poison an apple and curse it with sleeping death. Essentially, the person will go die, and while they will still be alive, it will be like their body is dead. And the only way to cure them is with love's first kiss. I have no idea why it's not just true love's kiss, but here we are. So, while the dwarves are gone off to work, the queen sneaks to the cottage disguised as the old hag, and then she convinces Snow White to eat the poison apple. Though I will admit that I do love that the animals tried to stop the evil queen, but Snow White, in her innocence, decided to bring her inside to hide her from the animals who were trying to protect her. And so Snow White ends up dying, and that's when all of the forest animals try to go get the dwarves for help, before she takes the bite out of the apple, but they're too late. So instead, when the dwarves show up, they try to get revenge on the evil queen, and then she ends up being chased up a mountain, and she tries to use a boulder to squash the dwarves, but instead, lightning strikes at that exact moment, making it so that the cliff below her crumbles, and she ends up falling to her death where a couple of vultures eat her bones. So the seven dwarfs return home and find Snow White dead, and they don't want to bury her because she's so beautiful. So they decide to just make a glass coffin, at which point they would surround it with eternal Virgil, which I guess means that she wouldn't decompose. And that's when the prince shows up. So in this movie, I really enjoy the fact that Snow White and the prince actually previously met at the very start of the movie, and Snow White actually does have a crush on him. But I don't really like how we don't really get to see how the prince meets Snow White. Instead, we just see him sneak into the castle walls, at which point he sings a love song to Snow White, which I'll admit is a romantic gesture, but it also means he might be a bit of a stalker, especially considering that Snow White is only 14 years old by the time she actually marries him, which I'm going to admit is not okay in modern times, but back when this movie is set, probably during the 1700s, which I will admit, back then that was actually normal, but in modern times, that would be very creepy. Especially considering that supposedly he spent months trying to find Snow White only to realize that she's dead and sleeping in a glass coffin. So he goes over to the coffin, opens it up, and then he gives the dead body of Snow White a goodbye kiss, which if that's not creepy stalker material, then I don't know what is. But luckily, that kiss wasn't actually a goodbye because it woke her up from the sleeping death curse and making it so that the two of them could live happily ever after as they take over the kingdom now that the queen is dead. So yeah, I will admit that this movie is actually really good. I love the animation, despite the fact that it's aged and definitely flawed. But again, that's just because it's the very first animated movie. This is the movie that created animation, which is really good. I also really enjoyed the music, especially the way that it would carry the characters' movements and actions, and of course, the way that the characters would talk with everything coming out in rhymes is actually really creative. The one thing I don't like is the story is pretty generic, but then again, we all know the story of Snow White. It's probably hundreds of years old by now. But as I was saying, the only bad thing I can say about this movie is, aside from the fact that it was made with ancient technology and that has obviously been outdated, the customs of what's going on in the story has also been outdated, which is a bit of a real shame because I bet this movie was universally loved back when it first came out. And honestly, I'm glad that this movie exists, not only because it created the Walt Disney Company, but because it created the entire animation industry as a whole. So with that in mind, this movie is good. Aged, and obviously it might be a bit outdated, but still really good. And I'm looking forward to see what they changed to make the modern remake better. I mean, I don't really expect the live action remake to be better than this movie. I just think that there will be some things it does better than this one does. However, that is for another video, as in next week's video. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to catch that as soon as it goes live. And also be sure to join my membership program by clicking the join button down below if you actually want to support the channel. But with that in mind, I hope that you're all staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye bye.
When you gotta. I gotta. It's coming. Hey! Stop! There. That'll hold him. Thanks.